full colonel came into my office that night after that drop, and he gave me a piece of film, and he said, Lieutenant, I want you, an officer, to develop this piece of film because it's top secret. And I was the officer in charge, so I went into the darkroom and I developed this picture, and to me it looked like a mushroom. That's all I knew. The security around the atomic program was so well documented, so well observed, nobody knew what was going on over in that Tinian Island. And that picture, I didn't know what it was, but that night over the radio station on the island, WXLD, they announced the dropping of the bomb, and they described the mushroom cloud, which I immediately tied up to that negative. And I didn't realize it, but I had developed the first picture of the atomic bomb blast.
Welcome to Triumphant Spirit, America's World War II Generation Speaks. This program is a series of broadcasts featuring the stories of a generation that fought and won the Second World War. No matter how they fought the war or where, on the home front or the battlefield, each veteran featured on the program contributed valiantly to a victory that changed the 20th century. Here are their stories in their own words. They are stories of actions and deeds that not only helped shape the outcome of the war, but the very world we live in today. With the capture of Guam in the Marianas Island chain in June of 1944, the American Army Air Force was able to begin bombing the Japanese home islands from the Central Pacific. For this purpose, the Air Force used the new long-range bomber, the B-29 Superfortress, that was designed specifically to reach Japan over the long distances of the Pacific. Assigned the mission of bombing the Japanese from the Central Pacific was the 20th Air Force. Serving as an aerial photographer in the 20th Air Force's 498th Bombardment Group was Irving Bauman, a young postal employee who was drafted into the service in 1942. Irv photographed the air offensive against Japan for posterity. It was one of the most grueling campaigns of the Pacific War. He was with the 498th when it earned a Presidential Unit Citation for its actions in the air war over Japan.
December 7th, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Where were you that day? Do you remember?
I was home with my family, working at my job, reading the newspaper with great apprehension because I knew that sooner or later I would have to be part of it.
What was the impact that it had on your life from that point on?
Enormous, because it was my opportunity to emerge from my status as a boy into that of a man because of my experience with the service.
Were you drafted?
No.
You joined?
Yes.
What service did you join? Did you have a preference?
I became interested in the aviation cadet program of the Army, and I thought I'd be a pilot, but unfortunately my color vision was limited, and so I was told to pick one of the ground options, one of which was aerial photography. Aerial photography means taking pictures from aerial cameras mounted in aircraft, whether they're fighters, bombers, reconnaissance aircraft, and taking pictures from high altitudes to the ground. We call that air-to-ground photography. The Army Air Forces sent me to a school where I was trained And I must say that the training was most complete and very enjoyable.
Where was this training located, Irving?
Well, I got my basic training at Boca Raton, Florida, and I got my technical training at Yale University.
How long was your training? What was the total training period?
Well, I had about 13 weeks in basic, and I had about 26 in tech training.
Were you assigned directly to a unit from training?
Not to the one I ultimately ended up with, but I bounced around between 4 or 5 different units while the B-29 program was in its evolution. But eventually I ended up with the group that I will describe.
And what was that group?
The 498th Bombardment Group.
Where were they located?
The stateside, Great Bend, Kansas, and overseas in the Mariana Islands.
So what's the role of aerial photography in combat?
When a bomber is sent over a target to bomb the area, the pilot, the navigator, must bring the airplane just over the target using photographic representations of the area. That they call those target folders. We prepare those photographs. When it gets to the target, the bombardier, when he drops his bombs looking through the bomb sight, it triggers off a pulse to an aerial camera in the back of the bomber, which starts picture taking every 6 seconds. And it photographs bombs away through impact on the ground. That essentially is what aerial photography.
Every bomber was equipped with a camera?
Most of them were, but it was the photo officer's choice as to outfit as many planes as we had cameras for.
Did you have aircraft specifically designed to take photographs?
All of them could take photographs. They all had the capability of the mounting of the aerial camera, the doors that would open when the camera would start taking pictures. All that was provided in all of the bombers of the B-29 series.
And your unit within the bombardment group was called what?
It was called my organization was called the 16th Photographic Laboratory of the 498th Bombardment Group.
And where was the laboratory located?
Saipan, Mariana Islands.
And were you there for the duration of the war, or did you move around?
2 years, same place, same area.
And the pictures were just fed back to your photographic location?
The pictures were given to the intelligence and operations officers so that they could decide whether or not the bombardment mission was a success or a failure. If the bomb picture showed, if the spotting photos showed that the target had been hit, then a new mission would be planned. If not, they would repeat the same mission. So in a way, the aerial photograph was the intelligence of operations to decide when and if a new mission would take place.
And you were involved in both analysis and developing pictures, the technical part and the analysis part, or just...
We had photo interpreters for that.
Okay.
My job was to make sure the cameras were operational, that they were installed properly, that the film was loaded into the magazines, which in turn were brought back to the photo lab, which I had to build. We had to build the lab in a jungle, essentially.
What would aerial combat be like if those pictures weren't available?
Well, it would all have to depend upon the briefing of the crew after the mission ended. After every mission, the combat crew meets the intelligence family, and they ask key questions, and they get responses regarding the relative success of the mission. If the and you know, a verbal description of an action is nowhere near as accurate as a picture, which is always worth 1,000 words. In 1931, the Japanese Empire began its campaign to dominate Asia. She started by invading China and ravaged cities one after another. And the behavior of the Japanese soldier is very well documented in a bestseller book called The Rape of Nanking, The Forgotten Holocaust of World War II. In this book, it's brought out that the Japanese murdered tens of thousands of surrendered Chinese soldiers between the period of December 37 and January 38. This killing continued before international witnesses with no attempt at concealment and with the sadism of recreational murder. I tell you this because this is the type of enemy that America would have to face. Now, from 1931 through 1941, the Japanese succeeded in overwhelming all of the Asian, a good part of the Asian and Pacific Ocean area, as illustrated in this slide. You will notice that I have a vertical line running to the right of the slide, which describes the furthest advance to the east that Japan was able to get to. The other line, which is a broken dotted line, represents the furthest that America was able to go west to approach Japan. You will see that that Japanese line on the right approached Midway Island and overcome with her relative success with the ocean area attacks, she took on America. And knowing that America had its fleet harbored or anchored in Pearl Harbor, she took on Pearl Harbor, and as you know, Pearl Harbor was bombed with tremendous casualties and damage. And 3 days later, America and Great Britain declared war on Japan. And 3 days after that, Germany and Italy declared war on America too. And so the United States was faced with a war on both off the East Coast and the West Coast, and she had to quickly mobilize to meet the declarations of war. I had drawn a very low number in the lottery. All veterans were supposed to register with their selective service boards, and we were given a number which went to Washington, placed in a big fishbowl, and these numbers were drawn in sequence to determine the time that you would be called up to active duty. And I fortunately drew a relatively low number, which gave me the option of looking and exploring my options, which I did. And fortunately, in October of '42, I was pinned down to the cadet program, which saved me from being drafted. But I was enlisted already. Now, unfortunately, the class I was supposed to join was filled, and I had to wait around for 6 months. All my friends left my neighborhood. I was all alone, the only young man on the, in the area. I felt very bad because here I was already committed, and they just didn't get to me. And so finally, I got the telegram, which gave me 3 days to get down to my basic training spot, which was over in Boca Raton, Florida. Now, with 3 days to go, I had a car that I had to get rid of. And there was nobody to buy it because all the young men were in service. I went into the nearest auto recycling business, and they offered me $5 for my car with a full tank of gas. The guy told me, dump the gas. We'll still give you $5, with or without. So he had my car with a full tank of gas for $5. There's about 13 to 15 different subjects which all of us got into for our basic training. Of course, we were out on bivouac. We went into the Everglades for overnight bivouacs, and I charged around like an infantryman, and I really hit the mud a lot, and the alligators were my friends. We really went through a lot of rough ground training. And then when that was over, after 13 weeks, I found to my extreme joy that I was being sent to a technical training center in New Haven, Connecticut called Yale University. Very intensive and concentrated training. I have the names of the graduates in my class. You'll notice that a fella that, for example, who comes from Twin Falls, Idaho, was assigned to Mitchell Field Air Force Base. But me, because I lived in New York City, they sent me to Clovis, New Mexico. The idea being that each of us was assigned to an air base furthest from our home. That was psychology of the Army Air Forces. And so these are the various ways our graduating class were assigned. Now, once I got into my first assignment, I learned a lot about the Air Force. To get bombs on the target, you had to have all of these different three functions that the slide shows you in order to get the bombs on the target. And I was very impressed with the magnitude of the intelligence behind the actual planning of these bomb missions. For a single heavy bomber, I learned that among the air crew, we had 5 commissioned officers: the commander, the pilot, the flight engineer, the bombardier, the navigator. And the enlisted personnel on these bombers were the radio operator, the CFC gunner, the flight gunner, the left gunner, the tail gunner, and the radar operator. Quite a group. These were the combat crews for the B-29s, I learned. And here is a picture which shows that to keep that one plane up in the air, you need all of these ground people to keep that plane flying. And mine was only one of the very many functions that was required to get a bomb on a target. In the European theater, the bombers that were available to the American forces were the B-17 Flying Fortress, which was called heavy bombardment, the B-24 Liberator, also heavy bombardment, and the B-26 Marauder, also heavy bombardment. But in the Pacific Ocean area, the distances were so great that we had to have a bomber that had much more travel capacity than any of these 3 heavy bombers. And so over in the design rooms, we had people on the drafting board designing a new super fortress, the B-29. We called that very heavy, VH. And you see, that was the workhorse of bombardment in the Pacific.
Do you have any idea when they started to use the B-29 approximately, year-wise?
1943.
43.
Now, there was a lot of gossip about this new formidable airplane, and this cartoon was circulated all over the Pacific. The GI's conception of the B-29. Everybody imagined that it had cannons on the wings. The armament was all fed by soldiers running on the fuselage. This cartoon made all the publications in the Pacific because of the guesswork that military people have when they anticipate a new weapon. I was in the 73rd Bomb Wing. Now, the first wing to go over to the Pacific Ocean area was the 58th Bomb Wing. And when I went to my first assignment in Great Bend, Kansas, I learned that the photo lab, which was already in operation for 4 or 5 months, and they were part of the 58th Bomb Wing, they were supposed to, after they completed their training, they were going to go over to the Pacific Ocean area, and they were sent to the CBI, China, Burma, India area. And they were going to bomb Japan from the west over the Himalaya Mountains to the island of Japan. And the 58th Wing, all 4 of the bomb groups were stationed at CBI, China, Burma, India.
Irving, do you recall the success that they had working out of India?
In the CBI airstrip, the airstrip was set up by laborious efforts by the Chinese to set up the airstrip. It took an awful lot of effort to get it in shape for the B-29s, but unfortunately, the distance from CBI to Japan and the troubles with the logistics of supply to bring bombs and supplies over the Himalaya Mountains was so formidable that the effectiveness of the 58th Bomb Wing was very limited, such that the best they were able to do was to get to the southern tip of Japan, and they couldn't go any further north because of the distances involved and because of the Himalaya mountain turbulence over the mountains. On the screen, you see a picture of my photo squadron. This is the 16th Photo Lab, which consists of 20 enlisted men and its commanding officer, which is yours truly. We were waiting at the railroad station all ready to board the train to take us to the port of embarkation. And we were a sharp-looking bunch. We had slept on our uniforms before we took off to make sure we looked sharp, as the picture will indicate. I don't know how many of you have taken cruises, but when you take a cruise with a troop ship, this is the result that you see on the screen. 4,000 men crowded into very tight quarters, all standing practically one next to the other. hammocks, just like you see it in the movies, for the enlisted men. The officers shared little rooms, 4 men to a room. For 49 days, we were on that boat. We had some, to keep my people busy, we used to meet on deck, and every day we would discuss technical subjects relating to aerial photography and our mission overseas. This is to keep us all in communication, because 49 days is a long time to be a captive on a troop ship, believe me. Here is the ground echelon that landed in Saipan. We had a big jungle area which the Marines cleared for us, but we all lived in tents, and these are the headquarters officers all lined up, the commanding officer, the adjutant, and the various, the chaplain is over there. In fact, you'll see me over on the extreme right, the Tarzan fellow there on the right, that's me. The commanding officer lived in that tent right behind us. Now this is our living area when we first got there. My command post was that pyramidal tent all the way in the back of the slide, and the enlisted men all had the little pup tents that you see in the foreground. We were there, as soon as we got there the second day, all of us came down with dengue fever. Dengue fever is a digestive ailment that attacks everybody that hits a jungle area. It's a 24-hour virus that disappears in 24 hours. But for the 24 hours, everybody was very, very sick.
Irving, what was the temperature like?
Temperature was at that time about 90 degrees. Very humid. Here is my area over in Saipan. There's my Quonset hut all finished on the left. You'll notice the supply tent next to it. You'll see some of the other buildings. And you'll also notice there are 2 big cubitaners. These came from the Navy. My supply sergeant was a very, very effective procurer. He managed to get from the Navy 2 floating dry docks, which we used as a water tank in return for some trading material. But the Navy would sometimes help us out. My supply sergeant was so good at communicating with the Navy equivalents that he managed to keep our refrigerator, which we were authorized because film has to be kept cool, aerial film especially. Of course, we had a front full of film, but behind our film were all the goodies from the Navy, because morale is a very important thing with men that have to work in closed quarters while kamikaze airplanes are flying overhead. So you have to keep the boys well fed, and well fed they were indeed because of my supply sergeant. 15 minutes after we finished this pay on a Sunday, we suddenly heard a terrible rat-tat-tat-tat-tat. A Japanese Irving flew low over South Tanapeg Harbor and flew low. He missed our radar completely, and he started to strafe our area. And my clerk and I, we hit the floor quickly. The Quonset hut was about 24 inches off the ground. And as we lay there, he hugging me like a baby, me hugging him like a baby and shaking, we saw the floor being ripped up about 18 inches away from where we lay. And we could see the light of day through the holes. And after the guy made a single pass, he got to the airstrip, and he destroyed a couple of our B-29s, and they shot him down, and he was a kamikaze. Of course, he died in the effort. Here's a typical aerial photo showing an explosion on the ground. The detail is quite good, and if you'll see on the top of the photo, there's what we call a frisket or a caption. Here's an airstrip picture of these B-29s, these formidable, huge airplanes, all getting ready to fly a mission to Japan. Here are these B-29s approaching the coastline of Japan, and you can see, well, Fujiyama is all the way on the left, just about out of sight, but these planes are all, and you notice on the tail we have the letter T, T for my bomb group, 498th Bomb Group. That's how we identify
Irving, did they face much opposition at that point in the war?
Oh, yeah. Now, speaking of opposition, it's a very good question. One thing that became obvious is that as these planes approached the target, the Japanese would send up fighters who would harass our planes and damage them. And many of them would lose an engine or two engines and would never be able to make it back to the home base. So it became, and the distance from the Marianas to Japan was 1,400 miles each way. The 29s could make that, but it had to have 4 engines. We had to have an in-between point for disabled planes to land, and this is why Iwo Jima had to be taken. And Iwo Jima was midway between the Marianas and Japan, and the Marines. It was a bloody battle, but we had to take it. And once we were able to get Iwo Jima, we were able to put fighters, our own fighters, on Iwo Jima, and they escorted the 29s into Japan. And of course, our 29s, if they ever were hit, they had a place to land. Here is a very nice shot of the planes passing Mount Fujiyama on their way to drop their eggs over their targets. This plane is flying in darkness, but it is lit up by the lights from the burning cities below. The lights were so intense that there was enough light to get that picture off of the fuselage of that 29.
Irving, who actually took these pictures, the in-flight pictures?
A plane flying beside that one.
And it was all fed back to your unit?
All the film came back. All this film had to be processed by my unit. This picture was a very popular picture showing how many bombs we dropped on Japan. Z square, that's the 500th bomb group there. And we used this photograph for psychological warfare. The psych warfare people got an idea of printing the Japanese yen on one side of the bill, and the other side of the bill they put a picture like this with the names of the next 11 cities to be bombed the next morning. And they dropped this money on all of these cities because psychologically it scared the dickens out of the Japanese people. Across the way from Saipan was an island called Tinian. And they were 1.5 miles away from where my slide showed you we were quartered. And we saw these B-29s over in Tinian, and apparently they used to go on these bombing missions too. But unbeknownst to all of these different bomb groups, one of them had the atomic bomb. But nobody knew which group had the bomb. Only the combat crew that had the bomb knew that it had the bomb. In spite of all the damage that was done by that bomb, and when that bomb was dropped, latter part of the 2 years I was over there, the 4 photo labs combined into a wing photo lab. So all of us ended up in a huge one photo lab. A full colonel came into my office that night after that drop, and he gave me a piece of film, and he said, Lieutenant, I want you, an officer, to develop this piece of film because it's top secret. And I was the officer in charge, so I went into the darkroom and I developed this picture, and to me it looked like a mushroom. That's all I knew. The security around the atomic program was so well documented, so well observed, nobody knew what was going on over in that Tinian island. And that picture, I didn't know what it was, but that night over the radio station on the island, WXLD, they announced the dropping of the bomb, and they described the mushroom cloud, which I immediately tied up to that negative. And I didn't realize it, but I had developed the first picture of the atomic bomb blast.